Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education's Zoom platform. We are so pleased and grateful to have you all here tonight. Before we dive into our talk, I just want to quickly share a little bit more about the museum. OJMCHE explores the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teaches the enduring and universal relevance of the Holocaust, and provides opportunities for intercultural conversations. We have a robust programming schedule, which includes book talks, artist-led workshops, programs that inspire civic engagement and democracy, and curator and artist talks like what we're doing tonight. We'll have some time for questions at the end of the presentation, so feel free to pop those into the chat or the Q&A box throughout the evening. And now for our program tonight, I'm going to hand it over to the exhibition curator, Ori Z. Soltes.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and once again to be here virtually with part of the Cahana clan. It's just a part of it. What I want to do is introduce things by way of the two threads that interweave the exhibition, and then see where they take us. So one thread, of course, the exhibit is called Survival. It's also called Intimations of Immortality. So Intimations of Immortality, I'll tackle first because one of the questions that humans have wondered about as long as we have been human and wondering is whether it is possible for us to achieve anything resembling immortality. It's the most fundamental issue that separates us from divinity. The gods don't grow ill, they don't grow old, they don't die. We do all of the above. And everything around us, like us, also dies, but doesn't think about immortality, but we do. And one of the ways that we have, as humans, achieved immortality is by producing offspring. So that if I have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who remember me, then there's a certain sense in which when I'm gone, I'm not gone. And on the other hand, if I am an artist in whatever the medium, whether it is visual, whether it is verbal, whether it is musical, whether it is movemental, to coin an adjective, the extent to which that remains after I'm gone also immortalizes me. And for most of us, it's a fairly limited scope, but occasionally you have someone like an Achilles who is remembered in a poem called the Iliad 32 centuries later. So he's achieved a kind of immortality in spite of having lost his life on the battlefield at Troy in his early 20s at the peak of his physical prowess. So this exhibition plays on that idea. It plays on the idea of transmitting from one generation to the next, which is not an idea that is by any means limited to Jews, but it's particularly important to Jewish thought. When you think about the fact that we stop our ordinary order of reading from the Torah in the course of the year, when we get to Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and we're deep into Deuteronomy, and we pit stop and backtrack, and we go all the way back to Genesis 22, the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, we realize part of that has to do with the notion that the covenant is transmitted in that moment from Abraham to Isaac. So it becomes a very powerful symbol of the transmission of covenant from one generation to the next. And the Jewish tradition, that moment connected to the Jewish New Year becomes part of the larger phenomenon of transmitting from one generation to the next. But what if instead of 2 generations, it's 3? What if the instrument of transmission is not just life and not just DNA, but art forms? So what if I am an artist and my child is an artist? To what extent does that child then wrestle with the question of how can I be my own artist and not just to chip off the old block? And to what extent can we recognize influence from me on that offspring's art the same way in any discussion of art history? We might say an earlier artist had such and such an influence on a later artist or not. And what again if it's 3 generations? And what if instead of one art form, we move from one to another? So for example, a painter and a sculptor, and the next generation a poet, and the 3rd generation a photographer and a cinematographer. How does that alter the dynamic of this issue of transmitting from one generation to the next and essentially creating an ongoing and evolving sense of immortality for the first artist, and ultimately, as we will see, for the second and the third as well, because time continues to go on. And that happens to be the situation that we have before us in the matter of this exhibition. Alice Lok Cahana, a painter and a sculptor, her son, Ronnie Cahana, who is a poet, his daughter, Kitra Cahana, who is a photographer and a cinematographer. That whole idea of moving from one generation to the next and using as the instrumentation of movement different art forms becomes wonderfully and complexly relevant and fascinating. But there's a second part of this particular exhibition, and that's that first word, survival. Because Alice Lok Cahana was a survivor of the Holocaust. She survived at the young age of 14 or 15 through, depending upon how you measure it, 3 or 4 camps. She lost much in order to make her way, but she survived, and she not only survived, she produced offspring. And not only did she produce offspring, she produced art. And not only did she produce offspring and art, she produced offspring who produced offspring who produced art, and so on and so forth. So the notion of survival and the notion of memory and the notion of how these things all play out in this exhibition. I'm about to share a screen, I hope. And I'm assuming everyone can see what I'm showing. Yes, this is just one installation shot of the exhibition. You can see it's a fisheye lens, and it's only one part of it, just to give you a bit of a sense, you viewers, particularly if you haven't been to the exhibition, of even from this glance, how rich and varied it is. You can see that straight in the center, there are 2 sculpted works. I'll get to that in a moment. You can see flanking them from 2 different galleries. We have 2 different, or in a sense, 3 different kinds of work. We have painting and we have photography. We have photography here. We have a particular kind of photography there. We'll get to that in a moment, or not in a moment, but before I'm finished. We have different kinds of very textured paintings here and a very different style and color there. All of this is part of the exhibition. The starting point, and I'm only going to say a little bit about the biographies of our 3 artists and what wraps around them. Starting point for all this could be an image like this. This is Alice Lok Cahana's family on what was their last family vacation, about 1940, just before the Holocaust had worked out. So we see different members of her family. We see Alice herself, and we also see her sister. We see different members, every single one of whom was lost, besides Alice. Well, her father was not lost because he was in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time, so that he was not where everyone else was when they were wrapped up. I'll get to that in just a moment. When they were caught up in the Nazi web that attack, when it attacked. This is one of Alice's paintings. One of the things that Alice said as she made her way through those camps, having been cut off from her family, having relocated her sister, so the 2 of them managed to survive together in the camps. She said, if I survive this, I'm going to someday become an artist. I'm going to turn the mud, the gray, the brown into color. And eventually she would, not until the 70s, she would produce an array of paintings which were literally rainbows from the ashes, in part because her life story took her by way of Israel and the husband she met there, Moshe, and his appointment as a rabbi in Houston, Texas, to Houston, where there was a lot of interest in color field painting. And that's where she started to step into her own. And also after a visit back to Sharvar, the community in which she had grown up, and the shock of realizing that no one remembered her family, no one remembered her mother, who had been so active in the community, she realized memory, commemoration, immortality, those aren't the words she was using, but it's the concepts that were motivating her. I need to bring these people into the foreground who have been left so far into the background. And this is not the first work she did, but it's the first word I'm showing you, because the title of it is, Have You Seen My Sister? Because her beloved sister Edith survived the war with her. And when they were recovering, her sister was very ill and she was taken to the hospital. She disappeared. Alice talked of crawling on her knees up the steps into the hospital to find her sister because she herself was so weak, and she wasn't there. and no one seemed to have any record or any memory of what had happened to her. So there is something profoundly emotional about this work, which you can't see as well here as you can. You got to visit the exhibit as you can in the exhibition. The combination of the photographic material that one finds here in particular and elsewhere, and the intense texture of the canvas surface that she has applied with colors that subtly mediate between the darkness of the blacks and the grays and the color, the reds, the purples, the yellows trying to push their way through. Keep the color palette in your mind because we're going to come back to it. Alice defeated Hitler in 3 ways. She survived, first of all. You're not supposed to do that, girl. Well, she did. Second, she began to establish her own family with Moshe in Houston, Texas. So the Hitlerian hope of the destruction of the Jewish people was personally pushed back against by her. So here we see Alice and Moshe with their 2 sons. We see Michael and we see Ronnie. And here we see another image of Alice with their daughter, Rina. So she produced 3 children. And she also defeated him because she turned the ugly destructivity of his operation into something which is wonderfully creative and colorful, rainbows from the ashes. I've just chosen a couple of her works to give you some sense of where she was going coloristically and conceptually. This is called Jacob's Ladder. And you can recognize, it seems to me, 3 things in particular about this work. One, of course, you get the idea of the rungs of the ladder. And second, you get Yaakov in Hebrew at the base. So instead of him lying there, his name is there. Think of how significant the idea of his name is. Because when he has 20 years later, his next experience with that which is beyond us, his wrestling match with God itself, his name will be changed to Yisrael. So his dream, in a certain sense, is a dream of the future. And the third thing you'll notice are these kind of semi-abstract angelic beings that are occupying the rungs of the ladder. And now I'm going to show you the same image as you see it in the exhibition, where you can get a better sense of the textured and layered and sculptural qualities of this work, which in the previous image you couldn't see, which is a reminder to all of us, you can't trust how an image looks if you're not seeing it in the flesh. And this is one example. So there is an irony, of course, because Jacob's Ladder also resembles the railroad tracks, which become an icon for art that commemorates the Holocaust, the tracks that are leading toward a place like Auschwitz. And it reminds me of the poem that Nelly Sachs, the last Jewish German poet to write in German, who survived the war in Sweden. And the Swedish have a particular connection to Alice that I'll also get to in a moment. The poem that she wrote, for which she won the Nobel Prize, called Oh, the Chimneys. And the backdrop of that is the chimneys of Auschwitz to which these railroad tracks are going. So the guy who ran Auschwitz, Rudolf Hess, jocularly used to say, "Oh, that's the freedom's way, Freiheitsweg," because you get off that train and then you're freed because you're thrown into the gas chamber and the crematorium and you go up in ashes. But these are angels of color, not ashes of gray and white. And Nelly Sachs's poem, Oh, the Chimneys, reads in part, "Oh, the chimneys on the ingeniously devised habitations of death, when Israel's body drifted as smoke." This is Israel who is Jacob, and this is Jacob who is Israel and his descendants, us. Through the air, was welcomed by a star, a chimney sweep, a star that turned black, or was it a ray of sun? Oh, the chimneys, freedom way for Jeremiah and Job's dust. Punning on that Rudolf Hess jocular note by reference to Jeremiah, whose view of these things was, you piss God off, you get punished. And Job, whose view was the opposite, he's suffering and yet he's innocent. So there is no clear explanation for why the innocent suffer. It doesn't have to do with punishment. It's a very important work. And here's a second one, which is not in the exhibition. You have to visit the Vatican to see it, because And there are images that you can see at the exhibition of the family going to Rome, going to Vatican City, and the conversation between Alice and Pope Benedict XVI when this painting was presented to the Vatican. It's called No Names. And there you see the railroad tracks of which I was speaking. There you see, rather than ashes, the numbers and letters that, of course, are the numbers and letters that would have been on Alice's arms, and those kinds of numbers and letters on millions and millions of arms. But the most important part, in a way, of this painting is that yellowish stuff that you see there in the upper middle part. And the Pope asked her, "What is that?" She said, "Every morning I wake up with the smell of the gas chambers in my nostrils. That's the miasma of that smell. How do you paint a smell?" And this was her answer. So Alice was not just a painter and a sculptor, very much someone who thought and thought and thought about the experiences that she had had, the way those experiences worked out, the way they might or might not be transmitted to her children and her children's children, and the meaning of everything. She's done a series of these sculptures of which I'm very fond. It was difficult to choose which one to show you. They're all Torah scrolls, except they're not Torah scrolls, are they? Because there are no texts, except the texts are there, but they're there in images, not in words. This particular one is the Wallenberg scroll. For those of you who don't know, Wallenberg was the Swedish diplomat who rescued many Jews until at the end of the war, he himself was carried off by the Soviets and never seen again. But among those he probably saved was Alice's father, because Alice's father was not in Sharvar when everybody else was rounded up there. He was on a business trip to Budapest, where presumably he was able to be rescued. And Alice and he would briefly encounter each other in Sweden after the war, where Alice went for recuperation before she went to Israel. So her connection to Sweden is layered, from Nelly Sachs to her own experience there, and as I will repeat in a few moments, and that's where Ronnie, as a rabbi, and his family ended up for 5 years, serving a congregation that was like the congregation that Alice's husband Moshe, Ronnie's father Moshe, served, including many Holocaust survivors. Complex interwoven threads in this magnificent tapestry of form and color. Which brings me to Ronnie, because I'm being brief. There's more, of course, that I can say, but there's also more for Ronnie to say and for Kitra to say. So I don't want to, as we say, hug the screen or the microphone. Ronnie had this extraordinary experience in 2011 when, and let me quote from one of his own prose pieces, "When my name exploded, I entered another dimension. His name exploded. My nape exploded. His nape exploded. I entered another dimension. Inchoate, subplanetary, protozoan universes are opened and closed continually. There are many when low who stop growing. Last week, I was brought so low, but I felt the hand of my father around me, and my father brought me back." So what you see here is an image made up of a whole series of images strung together by this amazing series that Kitra did called Stillman. And I think she's going to speak a little bit more about this, so I won't say much. But this is part of how the exhibition was organized to give a sense of that. If you look inside here, this inner area, a kind of exhibition within the exhibition space, is called the Temple of Healing, because on the interior you can see there are these large images of the Stillman series that Kitra did, and I've got one more. You can also see that Ronnie's poetry is along the column here. It's on the inside of this wall there, and here you see the column. The poetry is integrated by Ronnie. It's integrated with the images of Ronnie by Kitra. The outer carapace of the temple, you can just see a piece of it here, are other images by Kitra, by Alice. Within the darkest light, in this purgatory where I have lived, where I don't accusing lies ascend, spearing words that won't exit my body, I belong to the whole but one substance. I have the red sun's bleeding blood all in vain. What will emerge will purify. A tree is no longer a tree. Everything now is an impossibility for me to possess. All seems dispossessed. Everywhere is estranged. Nothing has citizenship. Yet the work is inside, a melting of bone to sinew. It is the mind that must take over now and become its own inner sky's sun. That poem, both that the last line of which echoes to me the black sun of Nellie Sachs, and also is part of Ronnie's response to his new condition, his dephysicalized condition, that, if anything, elevated the condition of his mind. And I think Kitra is going to say a bit more about that before we're finished, and people may have questions. But this work of his poetry that runs throughout the exhibit, and that reflects, on the one hand, as I just chose to read that one poem and that one prose piece, on his own condition, spends much more time reflecting on other things, like his wife, like his mother, like his father, like his children. And so he himself becomes a centerpiece verbally of both the relational reality and the artistic reality of his mother, the artist, and his daughter, the artist. In fact, this image by Kitra shows another one of those daughters. This is Bria, whom we see in the room with her father, with her Abba. Which brings me to Kitra, who, as she will tell us, was someone strongly influenced by her grandmother in ways that she's going to talk about, so I shan't. But the two things that I have noticed most particularly three things about Kitra's work are: one, she's drawn in particular to the disenfranchised. She's drawn to those whom others might not see, and she makes us see them. Two, her ability to make us see them is because of the way she's seen them, which, because of her empathy, has made them bring her in to their world. The third thing, which I'll get to last, has to do with a particular kind of relationship between her work in a completely different medium and that of her grandmother. So this is just one of her series. It's actually the base of a whole book that she did on American nomads. It's American kids, right, who wander around, who have no home, who choose rather to be outside this central strictures of the way our society operates. And this is just one image. This happens to be, as you can see, Subway, and they are singing. And on the other hand, this is a still from actual brief documentary she did, which is called The Different Kind of Force, and it has to do with the problematic of the mentally ill within America and how we are and are not and could and should handle that population, so that the police are often called in without proper training to deal with situations where either they need better training or they need those who have that training to assist them. And in a sense, Kitra's film is all about making us aware of that. How many Americans, how many people are aware of that part of our own society, our own country, and of who needs that kind of help, except they hear that someone was gunned down by a cop who got scared because he thought this guy was violent, who turned out not to be at all, or something of that sort. She enters into that world and empathizes with it, and therefore causes us to see it as we might not otherwise see. In the complete opposite direction, Canada, which is, of course, where she lives. This is one of my favorite. Again, this is a still from a documentary about a community up north in Canada near Hudson Bay, Arviat, in which the percentage of suicides was very, very, very high because the winter is long and the winter is depressing. And one of the ways in which the community came around to try and help its youth not be depressed, was by helping it look backwards to its past and resurrecting customs that had to do with dancing. And they created a whole series of dance competitions in December that would cheer. Everyone would look forward to them. And so the darkest of December would become a period of cheer and not a period of darkness. I happen to like this still because it's so poignant. You have Andy at the cemetery at sunset, and obviously someone very near and dear to him is the person buried there. Is it? We don't know. Is it? We don't know. I'm not saying that Kitra doesn't know. I'm saying we don't know. Is it a friend who committed suicide, which is a possibility? Or is it a sibling, the same? Or is it someone else? In a way, you see, it doesn't matter because the image is so poignant without knowing the details that you can make up details of just to flesh it out if you choose, but you don't have to. From snow to fire, from northern Canada to South and Central America, the cult of Maria Leonza, which plays with water and fire. And I've chosen the one image that is most extraordinary in terms of the fire side of things. As you can see, people jump through the fire. All kinds of directions Kitra takes us in. Of course, in between South America and Northern Canada, there is our own border. And the problematic of those desperate to come over the border, not because they're selling drugs, not because they're terrorists, not because they're bringing dangerous substances. The dangerous substances here are children, and they're trying to get across the border. So this film and a series of stills, Caravana Migrante, is another of my favorites. I confess they're all my favorites, so that's my problem. I'm just giving you a sense of some of these, and I repeat what I said at the outset of my comments on Kitra, the idea of what and whom she's drawn to as subject matter, and how she is able to find her way into whatever the community, individual groups with which she becomes engaged as a photographer or a cinematographer or both, is in part derived from the empathy that she possesses. And as she will tell you, some of that comes from what started with Alice, which leads me to two last images before I turn the conversation over to Ronnie and to Kitra. This is another view of the gallery. You remember you saw on the far right this image in the first image, and then you saw these scrolls. But now what I want you to look at these two things, because here is one of Alice's pictures, one of her paintings, and here is one of Kitra's photographs. Now we're too far away to see details, it doesn't matter. Even from this distance, look at the color sensibilities. There is something so similar in the way in which they are revisioning the particular parts of the world that they're showing these two images, that it's a rather literal example of how, from one generation to the next, a kind of immortality and survival has brought memory from past to present to future. And I end where I began, except with a new beginning. So the first image of family I showed you was Alice and her family in its last pic. Here we have Alice and Moshe surrounded by their sons, wives, their daughter, and so many of those grandchildren that, to repeat what I said at the outset, Alice defeated Hitler three ways. She survived, she created a family, and she created art, and she created a family that creates art. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to, who's next, Ronnie or Kitra?
Ronnie.
Okay, Ronnie, the floor is yours.
It's so beautiful, Ori.
Thank you.
I thought I was the only one that knew that my mother is immortal.
I thought I was the only one who knew that my mother was immortal.
My mother survived with one hope.
My mother survived with one hope.
It was her catch-up. As she walked the grounds of Auschwitz.
It was her catch-all as she walked the grounds of Auschwitz.
She said in a vow, I will never hate.
She said in a vow, I will never hate.
was her truth.
It was her truth.
So she could transmit beauty back into the world.
How she could transmit beauty back into the world.
And I, in my poetry, always very hard to find its meaning.
And I worked very hard in my poetry to find its meaning.
What do I have to say?
What do I have to say?
I can't recreate
That I can't recreate me,
that I can recreate inside myself
that I can recreate inside myself.
my meaning and my truth.
My meaning and my truth.
In Hebrew, the word artist or man
In Hebrew, the word artist, oman,
has many connotations.
it has many connotations.
The word man has the root of belief.
The word oman has the root of belief.
What do you believe
What do you believe?
is who you are?
What you believe is who you are.
I think about that as I collected on my writing.
I would think about that as I collected my writings.
What sustained my work? What was I seeking?
What sustained my work and what was I seeking?
The word that comes out also of art and belief is the word paper and the MI.
And the word that comes out of belief and of art is ne'eman,
which means faithfulness.
which means faithfulness.
What will I always be faithful to? How do I find a faithfulness?
What will I be faithful to? And how do I find my faithfulness?
God.
To God.
Because and faith and refusing hatred.
Because art and faith and refusing hatred
means I want to recreate in the world
means I want to recreate in the world
beauty, love. And so ugly.
I want to recreate in the world beauty and love.
So all my poetry, my love letters
So all my poetry are kind of love letters
to my wife,
to my wife,
to my children,
to my children,
to God,
and to God.
because the greatest gift that God gives us
Because the greatest gifts that God gives us
is to participate in the world and add our own creation
is to participate in the world and to add our own creation
to what life means,
to what life means.
the life force that the Almighty gives everyone.
It's the life force that the Almighty gives everyone.
So I wrote a poem of my own biblical way.
So I wrote a poem in my own biblical way.
Um,
Yeah. biblical,
different songs,
different psalms,
praises,
praises,
and love in this world.
love in this world.
I'd like to share with you one poem
I'd like to share with you one poem
of God creating,
of
God creating human life
God creating human life
and His creation
and
called No Roots.
God's creating. It's called No Roots, and it was written
Before this
before the stroke. Yeah.
Kitra.
No roots. He met a loneliness inside himself, loaned and leaned besides himself, within this true no-roots truce. He bunkered between himself, yes, those two trees as distance be your two legs that God stands upon, which he walks through his guarded garden. We didn't know there was a way out, man says to woman. Which tree should I have eaten, she clings. He has grown in his groin, she has earth as her heart, as both loathe growth away from the God-maker man. And so they began. If God can walk, then we can shelter in bushes. God will show us a tree that can make water sweet. This locus is a wandering, not an amble, not recitable, but so God walks through our coffins because we will not come back except through that door. What is it you need if not me, she pleads? What is it that co-conspires? A man must answer if a man demands. A man must forswear his craft. A man denies who delegates his sewer. And so choose or fuse, tree trunk and branches, the trees must have their outreach. Sun and earth, the brambles have no roots, to what we call knowledge, towards which we shall see God someday in the desert, walking through the clefts of a song.
We shall see someday God walking through the cleft of a song.
We shall see God walking through the clefts of a psalm.
I also want to share
I also want to share
a poem to my wife
a poem to my wife
on her birthday.
on her birthday 10 years ago.
Please keep to
Please keep to Fiddle said dog. Fiddle said dog for Karen's 56th birthday. I recall the burden of not knowing you, an imaginary time since the broad expanse of that kiss, spreading the universe to an endless color. Bygones and unbeguns. Hearts are won by lakeside where stars pierce warming waters. I can see you then again. The mind went dizzy. Uponed, up and down. Jerusalem in your eyes.
everything is what you believe and what I learned from my mother.
Everything is what you believe. And what I learned from my mother
It's love the life, the miracle that you still have.
It's to love the life and the miracle that you still have. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Fabulous. Kitra, you're the next link in this chain. Floor is yours.
Um, okay, so I wanted to start with a mantra that has reverberated throughout my life, and it's this mantra that's from one of my grandmother's poems, and I'll just read the beginning of her poem because she was we we didn't touch on it so much, but she was a beautiful writer as well. And one of her, she often said that it's both her art and her writings that were her kaddish for the people who did not survive. Um, and so this mantra that's kind of guided my life comes from a poem that she wrote after liberation, I think just as she was recovering in Sweden, called The Shadows at Night. The shadows in the dark question me, are you defeated? I answer, oh no, not me. Then you must be mad, child. Don't you see the long line? Children, grown-ups in the endless night, the fire around them engulfs their faces, but they still whisper prayers. And you who got life instead, what will you do with the memories of that long night? And and it's really those words. And you who got life instead, what will you do with the memories of that long night that um, reverberate through me and throughout my life and throughout my practice as an artist and as a journalist. And it's at times it's loomed over me in a difficult way, and other times it's given me strength. And it's a question, what do we do with the gift of life, the gift of survival, as my father was just saying? And as Ori was saying, my existence is only because of her survival, and my father's existence is only because of her survival. And as a child, this environment of being raised with the Holocaust all around us in her paintings and her stories. Her stories were throughout our home and throughout our dinners. And anytime we would be with her, her story of survival and of horror and of loss were very much at the foundation of our connections. Um, and also her just grandeur. She had a larger than life kind of way, and she loved life so much. But it was always this duality between the horror and how this the gravitas of life and then this lightness. Um, and this is what surrounded me. It was the emotional landscape of my childhood, and her art was the aesthetic landscape of my childhood. This is a picture of her and some of her art. You see here, there's a prayer right in the center and the barbed wire around. But she also stood for hope. It bends towards the light, as Ori said, from ashes to the rainbow. That was her collection and what she called her core collection. Um, And when Rachel approached me to talk about this exhibit, the idea for this exhibit of looking at three generations of artists within one family, and how we don't, that it is not only trauma that is passed through the generations, which is so often spoken about, but it's also this kind of unspoken thing that I don't feel many people acknowledge, that we learn how to live through and how to that survival is taught through the generations. And in the case of my grandmother, we survive through making art, through telling our story. And so when Rachel and Ori approached me, um, I was just overwhelmed by their description of what they wanted to create in this exhibit because it's so perfectly aligned with how I already viewed my own life and my own practice as a journalist and as a photographer. Um, it was if it was kind of an out of body experience, that first conversation, because I felt like Rachel was kind of explaining my own life story to me when we first met. Um, and you know, her art, it was she without her, I would not be an artist. I would not have the kind of aesthetic language that I have. Our home was surrounded, her art was surrounded us in our home. And she would often, and we would go to Houston to her studio, and she would, her art, she had this beautiful studio with a skylight. And she would oftentimes prepare before we would come her latest work, the pieces that she was working on. She would have it on display very prominently as you enter her studio. And and she would gather myself and others around, and she would ask, "What do you see?" She loved this question. I remember her taking me to the Rothko Chapel in Houston, and again there she would point up at these beautiful abstract paintings, and she would again say, "What do you see?" And she was, so invested in our inner voices, our inner creativity, our inner worlds, and also our inner moral development. I think that was also very important to her. Um, and she was a remarkable influence on my life. I just wanted to share this one video of me at 2.5, um, painting in her studio with her guidance, and she's asking if one day I'll become a painter.
Amazed at 2.5. And I asked Kitra if she really wanted to be a painter, and she said yes, she wants. So it was beautiful. Right? This is water and gesso.
Mhm.
Some of it really open. Yeah, some of it really open, but it's nice and colorful. So it is under and over and over and under colors, right? We have all kinds of layers of colors. You show it to me. Oh. Should we do under and overnight? A little bit, we let it dry, okay? Because it's very too.
Wonderful.
And um, and so her pieces, these extraordinary mixed media pieces, um, I think also very much affected me in terms of the photographs that she would embed within them. And I really think upon reflection, like um, the photographs of the Holocaust that she had in her paintings, and that I then witnessed as we did a road trip around all across Europe when I was about 9 years old, where we went from concentration camp to concentration camp, with all the kids. Uh, and then facing some of those photographs in those museums, like 10 feet high, I think those were some of the first documentary images that really shaped my life and shaped my sense of imagery and the importance of documentation and bearing witness, and not just to some of the most, you know, horrific moments in history, but also it opened me up to then exploring photography and also the most beautiful moments in history, because oftentimes the most horrific and the most beautiful and most humanity exists side by side in some of the most and even the darkest places. And so I don't know if you can see in this image, but oftentimes she would have photographs and paint, and she was very experimental in her techniques, burning the edges of the paper. If when you would walk into her studio, there would be so many different materials, cooking ware that she would experiment to see how to create different textures. She was just so innovative, and I I think that that charge to bear witness and the importance of witnessing and having documentation, especially in an age where there is so much misinformation and where so much is called into question by people that journalists are there documenting. And I really learned that from my grandmother. Um, and she also instilled in me this, you know, I think her message was one of hope, and it was very particular to the Shoah. But her message and the message that I took away was never again really means never again for anyone. And as Ori mentioned, she was so focused on Raoul Wallenberg and righteous Gentiles and those who saved Jews, putting their own lives at risk. And she really truly wanted us to live according to the Jewish belief of Tikkun Olam, to repair the world, and to live by those examples like Raoul Wallenberg. And Ori spoke a little bit about empathy, and she also modeled this through her greatest art, which was Rena, my aunt. And she modeled how to approach every human as though they are truly a vessel of God, as they are. And she was very much our teacher in that regard as well. This was a photograph I took of my grandmother and Rena just a number of years before she passed away. And so, with her inspiration, it led me to start documenting stories around the world. I've been working as a photojournalist and filmmaker since I was 16, 17, 18, a very long time. And with a camera in hand, photography became my medium. And I see her influence throughout many of the projects that I have taken on. And that's why I think to me this exhibit makes so much sense. Um, in the exhibit, we have this series that I just worked on last year with my partner in Chile. The the project is called Memory is an Act of Justice. Be Zachor is an act of justice. Memory is so important to us when we think about the Holocaust, and it's documenting families of those who were disappeared by the Pinochet regime in Chile. And even in working on this story, that question again reverberates through me. What will you do with the memory of that long night? And it was so interesting to be in a place where other people were also asking that question, what do we do with our memory? Um, and 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 then in other projects, I think about her as well. Like in the exhibit, there's my series Caravana Migrante, as Ori mentioned, where I spent time in Tijuana at the by the wall at the border and spent time with migrant communities who are running from some of the most difficult and challenging situations and trying to come to a new land to start over, very much as my Savta did, who was a child refugee alone in this world. And I think about, when I was taking this photo of this young woman, I thought about her just being a young woman trying to find a better life for herself alone, crossing alone, or whatever friends she had made along the way. And that's also how my Savta had to flee where she was from and find a new home and find new roots. And no roots, new roots. Um, and I also and working on stories at the border very much, especially in these last couple of years, reminds me of family separation, which was also my softest story, when all of these parents are separated from their children here at the US-Mexico border, and I think and for years are not reunited. They don't even know where some of them are. It's like lost in the system. Um, I think about my grandmother and her sister Edith, and how Safta Aliza, as we call her, spent her entire life searching for Edith. As Ori showed this one painting and right in the center, this is Edith. This is a photograph of Edith.
What's your middle name, Kitra, and why?
My middle name is Eden in memory of Edith. Um,
Thank
and my daughter's name is Rakia Alice, who also in memory of Alice. And so we have that.
you. The fourth generation, ladies and gentlemen, by the way. Sorry. Go ahead.
And between us are the two sisters, which is just so beautiful to me. Ooh, yeah. And so in thinking of Edith, I wanted to share another excerpt from my grandmother's unpublished book. This is kind of it's a very small little book, but it shares her story. And this was her final lose. This is her account of her losing touch with Edith. The book is called Empty Windows. We cooked our first meal in freedom and ate it as if it was the most exclusive meal. Soon after that, Edith got very sick. Take me to the hospital, she begged me. I became frightened. What if they separate us again? But Edith insisted, and we began to look for the temporary Red Cross hospital. By the time we found it, we could barely walk. They admitted Edith and told me to go back to the barrack. I begged them to let me stay with her, but they refused. I walked out the door, waited outside for a while, and when no one watched, I entered the hospital again and tried to help around with the sick, hoping that I would blend in and become part of the hospital staff. It did not take long before they discovered me, bodily removed me from the hospital, and brought me in a jeep to our barrack. Early next morning, I went again to the hospital, determined that this time I would not leave Edith, no matter what. Just as I arrived, I saw them putting Edith into an ambulance. Where are you taking her? I want to go with her, I begged. You are not sick enough, came the sharp reply. I climbed up the ambulance and spoke a few words with Edith. The driver pulled me down. We have to leave now. You must go, he said. Please, please, I pleaded, but the ambulance moved away. They took me that they told me that they were taking her to Bergen and that in a few days all of us would be taken there because Bergen-Belsen would be evacuated. I pretended to faint and fell on the ground. Someone pushed medication down my throat. That made my heart beat faster, and I was helped into a jeep that was parked near the ambulance. The jeep took me back to my barrack. The driver looked for the person in charge. Her sister died, he said. No, I protested in broken English. Please understand, my sister is not dead. I spoke to her a few moments ago, but it was hopeless. The driver left me in the barrack. 3 days later, they took us to Bergen. I immediately began to search for Edith. Someone told me that there was an office where everyone was registered. With great difficulty, I found the office. It was on the second floor. I could not walk any longer. I had to crawl every step up the 3 flights. The man at the desk looked at the lists. Then he said, "She is not on the living list, and she is not on the dead list." Liberation for us came too late, for I never found Edith. And when um when my father first had his stroke, um, the world went blank for all of us, and I was terrified to walk into his room. But my mother had told me that we could communicate with him through reciting the alphabet, and he would blink at each letter, and letter by letter, we would be able to talk to each other. And so I entered that room afraid for what had changed. But letter by letter, it was revealed that he was more of himself inside, more crystal clear in who he was and what he had experienced. And he had this need to express it and to get everything that was inside of him out. And so, letter by letter, in this very tedious process, we began writing poems and sermons together and expressing all he was experiencing inside. Um, and, as we had learned from our Savta, we coped with that trauma of the moment by turning to art, my father to poetry, and for me, I picked up my camera. And initially, I started taking very traditional documentary style photographs, like the one you see here, of a man in a hospital bed with a trach attached to a breathing machine. But it became clear to me that I had to begin finding a new language for the photography in order to really express this like holy experience that we were all going through together. I was singing Hebrew nikunim every day to him, and in between singing, working on his body, and photographing and writing poetry and sermons. And so I found this new visual language of layering photographs together, trying to touch upon this kind of mystical experience that was taking place, transforming in our hospital, in our ICU room, in the hospital room, and in all of the rooms that we have been in since. And again, that question, and you who got life instead, what will you do with the memories of that long night, came to the front and came to the fore. And I ask all of you as well, like, what will you do with your memories of your long nights? And thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kitra. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that others will have questions they'll put in the chat. But meanwhile, tell me two stories. One, getting your hair cut with Alice, and two, your 14th birthday. I think it was your 14th, and your thoughts because of Alice.
15th, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, she she loved to take us to get our hair done, and she would always, as we're lying there getting our hair done in these salons in Houston, she would talk about having her hair shaved in Auschwitz, and how the dignity of a person is in their hair, and how important it is to care for your hair, so that the every moment with her was was profound. She never let a moment pass without sharing something. She would oftentimes kind of um, we couldn't just have a dinner with her without everyone standing up and making a speech and addressing the moment of what we were encountering together. And she would call upon all of us to do this. And oftentimes her speeches was contrasting um, the horrors of the past with the beauty of the moment. Um, and she was larger than life. She loved to laugh. She loved to be alive. She loved decadent sweets. She loved to have her hair done and to have beautiful clothes and jewelry. And she really she's foundational to everything I am.
And when you
And
turned 15?
yeah, and when I turned 15, it was just, when I talk about that gravitas, that was also kind of the difficulty, the other side, the shadow of being raised with so much, with just a innate knowledge that that kind of horror, the horror of the Holocaust, could exist. It was it's a shadow in my life, for better, for worse. And at 15, that was really the year where I I ex I had her in my mind all the time, because that was the age that she was when she was taken to Auschwitz and had to survive, and lost her mother and her two brothers, little beautiful boys, and her grandfather in the gas chambers. And just, because of that, my father he has no uncles or aunts. And that's just one story of so many of our people. And so, yeah, it was also really the time when that that phrase "never again," which is kind of the cliche of the Holocaust, the phrase that's come out of it. But for me, it really meant never again for anyone, and that we must devote our lives to, um,
Tikkun Olam.
yeah, to Tikkun Olam, not only for our people, but for all people and for all injustices that we see.
Karen, may I ask you a question? You unofficially, officially? Do you mind describing for us the first time you saw Ronnie? Is that okay to impose that on you?
Yes.
Not at first sight.
Well, so the first time, yes, thank you. So I was about 12, Ronnie was about 17.
An old
And
man.
quite a distance. But I saw him, we were in a camp setting, and I saw him walking through the woods. It was my first time I saw him. And I was watching him, and as he walked, he had a particular, it's a beautiful thing, because in our minds, we dream of Ronnie to this day. Everybody who has dreams of him, he is walking, and he had a particular gait that was the gait of a gazelle. So as he was walking through the woods, there was a kind of this, I don't know, there was a lightness and a strut as he passed through. I was just captivated with the movement. And to this day, we all dream. Whenever we have dreams of Ronnie, he is always walking. So
I have a second question. This is
yes.
actually for Ronnie, but to help with the answer. When you were still in high school, I think, and you were already writing poetry, and a poet, you'll say the name, I'm not going to, came to Houston. Am I correct? And you were invited to spend time with him in New York studying poetry. Can you tell us a little about that?
For some reason, John Ashbery ended up in my family.
John Ashbery.
Ended up in my parents' dining room.
For some reason, we don't know why, John Ashbery ended up in my parents' dining room.
And my parents told them, my son wants to be you when he grows up.
And my parents told him, my son wants to be you when he grows up. A renowned poet. Yeah.
Then he looked me up, I'm coming.
And then he looked me up on,
I'm coming to your university.
oh, he looked you up. I'm coming to your university, which was the University of Texas.
Love to meet you.
I'd love to meet you.
I said, likewise.
I said, likewise.
God.
And it happened. So then when you went to New York, then you connected and you studied with John Ashbery. He was a very renowned American poet.
I love it. Fabulous. I have another question. It's a broader familial question for anyone, but I think I'll direct it to Kitra. Tell us a little bit about your siblings and your cousins, specifically with respect to arts, because I'm aware of it and I'd like you to share it with our audience. That's okay.
Yeah, so art permeates the family. It's not just my father and myself who are artists, but my cousin Casper is a beautiful artist, and my sister Tamira also does very intricate drawings, and my sister Bria is a soferet, and my brother Dvir likes to do music, and so
Tell us what a soferet is, please.
a Hebrew scribe.
Thank you.
So she can do a Megillah, or she can do your mezuzahs and and do very beautiful sofrut, Hebrew scribing.
Mm-hmm.
Big fan.
And what?
What did you say, Ronnie?
Big fan.
It's a dancer.
And Lisa Dancer, and and Ida is a beautiful cantor, of course. And so we're all, I think we're all influenced by this environment of art making within the family.
Yeah, it's quite an amazing project, the Cahana clan, and its devotion, dedication, and involvement in the diverse arts. I'm sorry that I've not had the opportunity around Purim to be in Portland to see the Purim spiels that Michael and Ida Ray cook up.
Yes.
But I've seen posters, so I have some sense just from titles and the like that they must be pretty clever and a lot of fun. But I haven't had that opportunity yet. I'm sure the rest of you have. So you got one up on me on that one anyway.
But I think I just will say that, yes, I think art runs through it. And I think the charge that you talked about, Kitra, also to live a meaningful life.
Mhm.
That it's not only about self, but it is about giving to others. And I think that runs through it very dramatically, also through everybody, to be purposeful and to make the world a kinder, more loving place of laughter.
So with that in mind, I have two other questions, one for each, one for Ronnie and one for Kitra. It's a sort of statistical question for Ronnie. Because you've written a lot of poems, and particularly since the stroke, the process that Kitra referenced is extraordinary. At the outset, when you could move nothing but your eyelids, and so, as she said, letter by letter by letter by letter to get word by word. It's like it's Kabbalah in reverse. Instead of deconstructing the phrases to words, to letters, to sounds, you had to go backwards with that process. So how many nowadays, how often are you composing a poem? How frequent would you say? He's thinking about that one.
I'm inspired every day.
I dream.
Hmm?
I dream.
I dream poetry.
I try to live poetic,
I try to live poetically.
but I am composing in my sleep.
I'm composing in my sleep.
These beautiful words
Beautiful words
that sustain my.
and they sustain my life.
So you realize, of course, that you're a dual personality, because on the one hand, of course, you became John Ashbery, and on the other hand, if I may quote, sir, in my mind and in my dreams every night, I, Chagall man, float over the city. So both Ashbery and Chagall, not a bad combination, I might add. Which leads me to a question for Kitra. What are you working on now, kid? Or what's your next project?
Um, actually, I work a lot with my partner, and so we did that project in Chile that was just recently published. Um, and in about a month, we're going to be going to Mauritius with the
Mhm.
baby and with my mother. We're actually exploring, I got a grant to work on another project about the Holocaust directly about from my mother's side. Um, her grandparents, my great grandparents, were both imprisoned there, along with about 1,500
In
other
Mauritius.
in Mauritius in a prison,
Wow.
the Balbasan prison in Mauritius, along with about I think it's 1,500 other Jews from Europe who were fleeing. They tried to get to Palestine, and the British intercepted their boats
Wow.
and sent all these Jewish refugees to a prison where they spent the next 4 or 5 years, the
Mind
duration
boggling.
of the war, just in this
And
prison
this is still during or after the Holocaust?
during
During.
yeah they
40 to 5.
So during the period of the white paper, etc. So they wouldn't allow only a limited number of Jews could come to Palestine.
yeah
Got it.
it's not a very well known
No, it's not.
Holocaust history, and so we're going to be going to the prison where there's actually still a Jewish cemetery, and there's a little museum there, and so I'll be working on a project about that.
Wow. Impressive. And when exactly is that?
I think maybe in about a month.
Wow.
And then another
Fabulous.
project, during the pandemic, I made a film with my father about his experiences living in a long-term care home, living in lockdown.
Right.
And the film is in the show. It's called Perfecting the Art of Longing.
Yes.
But I'd also like to, I'm looking into making a a book that is less about my father's particular experience and more about what took place during the pandemic in long-term care, um,
Yeah.
where so many of our elders uh, were really like in the epicenter of the epicenter, dying by the tens
Right.
of thousands and very much forgotten, both then and definitely now. So I feel that there hasn't been there hasn't really been a reckoning with what took place and how our elders and people with disability and the workers in these institutions were discarded. And so this is another project that I hope to start working on.
That's fantastic. And for those of you who didn't notice what was just put in the chat, there is a link that you'll find there to Ronnie's site and his poetry, because obviously we didn't even touch the surface. We weren't even close to touching the surface. You can find a little bit more of it in the book, the catalog about the exhibition, where, by the way, you can also find a couple of essays, two by scientists talking about the whole chemistry and the DNA of transmitting trauma from one generation to the next, and a third by someone who was very much a pioneer in recognizing that the survival of a trauma is not limited to the survivor, but if that survivor has children, it cannot not affect the children. And now, more recently, of course, it's become clear that it goes on to the third generation. So we're talking both from the psychological side, but also in terms of two of those essays from the physiological side. So yeah, very important to think about. Is there anyone out there in our audience who has a last question to pose to any of us? Well, then I think this is we're close to the hour, a good point to hand the baton back to Mariah, so you can thank everyone, as I want to thank everyone for joining us. And you can just see Kitra just put something in the chat about sharing the film Perfecting the Art of Longing, which I can personally say I highly recommend. And we have a piece of it in the exhibition, but you need to see more than pieces. Mariah?
Yeah, well, if you want to come see a piece, you have until May 25th in our gallery up in Portland. The show is up for another couple months, so please do come. It's really incredible. We do have a few other programs coming up that are related to this exhibition, so stay tuned to our newsletter and to the link that Amber posted for the exhibition website. You'll see all the affiliated programs. There are more to be added even still that are all up there right now. And yeah, my sincere, heartfelt thanks to everybody. Kitra, Ronnie, Karen, Ori, thank you so much for this beautiful and really inspiring conversation. I really enjoyed learning more about your family dynamics and about the show every time I hear you all speak. So thank you. And there's some really sweet comments in the chat. I just wanted to point that out, especially for Karen and Ronnie. You're getting a lot of love from Los Angeles and from New Jersey.
And even from Rabbi Michael Cahana, whoever that is.
Whoever that may be. He's going to be leading some extra special tours too. So definitely stay tuned, and lots happening with this wonderful exhibition that we are very grateful to have at our museum.
Well, thank you also very, very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. Okay.
Bye for now.
All right, take care. And this recording will be posted on our website. So if you know someone who wants to see it, couldn't be here tonight, the link will be up in just a few days.
Great.
Okay, have a great night. Thank you all.